The morning mist clung to the Rubicon River like a shroud of destiny. It was January 10th, 49 BC, and Gaius Julius Caesar stood at the water's edge, his withered hand gripping the reins of his horse. Behind him, the 13th Legion waited in perfect formation, their bronze armor gleaming in the pale winter sun. Before him lay the shallow waters that marked the boundary between Gaul and Italy, a boundary no Roman general was permitted to cross with his army. Caesar was 51 years old, his once dark hair now streaked with silver, his face lined by 9 years of brutal warfare in the forests and mountains of Gaul. Yet his eyes burned with the same ambition that had driven him from the slums of the Suburra to the heights of Roman power. This moment would define not just his fate, but the destiny of the Roman Republic itself. The son of a minor patrician family, Caesar had clawed his way up Rome's treacherous political ladder through a combination of brilliant oratory, ruthless pragmatism, and an almost supernatural ability to read the desires of the Roman people. By his 40s, he had served as consul, the highest office in the Republic, but it was his appointment as proconsul of Gaul that would transform him from politician to legend. Gaul, modern-day France, Belgium, and parts of Switzerland, was a land of fierce Celtic tribes, dense forests, and ancient mysteries. When Caesar arrived in 58 BC, he found a complex tapestry of warring peoples, the Helvetii moving westward in massive migrations, the Germanic tribes pressing across the Rhine, and the proud Gallic chieftains defending their ancestral lands with desperate courage. The Helvetii were the first to feel Caesar's strategic genius. When they attempted to migrate through Roman territory, Caesar struck with lightning speed. At the Battle of Bibracte, he deployed his legions in a masterful display of Roman military engineering. The legionaries advanced in their famous testudo formation, shields locked together like the Shalaba tortoise, while Caesar himself rode among them, his red cloak billowing behind him like a banner of war. Men of Rome. Caesar's voice carried across the battlefield, strong and clear despite the clash of weapons. Today we fight not just for conquest, but for the glory of our ancestors. Show these barbarians what it means to face the eagles of Rome. The battle was a slaughter. Celtic warriors, brave but undisciplined, threw themselves against the Roman lines only to be cut down by the methodical advance of professional soldiers. Caesar's tactical brilliance turned what might have been a difficult campaign into a decisive victory. The Helvetii were forced to return to their homeland, and Caesar had his first taste of Gallic gold. But Caesar's greatest challenge lay ahead. In 52 BC, the Gallic tribes united under a charismatic young chieftain named Vercingetorix. This warrior king of the Arverti tribe possessed something Caesar had rarely encountered: a strategic mind that could match his own. Vercingetorix understood that the Gauls could never defeat the Romans in open battle. Instead, he employed a scorched earth policy, burning towns and crops to deny the Romans supplies, while using guerrilla tactics to harass their columns. The siege of Gergovia nearly ended Caesar's career. The hilltop fortress seemed impregnable, and for the first time in his Gallic campaigns, Caesar was forced to retreat. His legions were demoralized, his reputation tarnished. But Caesar was not a man to accept defeat. He regrouped, rebuilt his forces, and prepared for the final confrontation. That confrontation came at Alasia, a fortress city perched on a mountain plateau. Vercingetorix had gathered the largest Gallic army ever assembled. Over 80,000 warriors crowded into the hilltop stronghold. Caesar's response was audacious even by his standards. He surrounded the entire city with a double wall of fortifications, one facing inward to contain the defenders, another facing outward to repel the inevitable relief army. The siege lasted for months. Inside Alasia, starvation stalked the defenders. Outside, Caesar's legions labored day and night digging trenches, building palisades, and preparing for the greatest battle of the Gallic Wars. When the relief army finally arrived, a massive force of 250,000 Gallic warriors, Caesar found himself trapped between two enemy forces. The final battle was a masterpiece of military genius. Caesar divided his forces, holding the inner walls, while launching a devastating cavalry charge against the relief army. At the climactic moment, he donned his distinctive red cloak and led his reserves in a personal charge that shattered the Gallic lines. Vercingetorix, seeing his people's cause was lost, made the ultimate sacrifice. He rode out of Alasia alone, cast his weapons at Caesar's feet, and surrendered himself to save his people from total destruction. The conquest of Gaul made Caesar fabulously wealthy and gave him the loyalty of battle-hardened legions. But it also made him enemies in Rome. The Senate, led by his former ally Pompey the Great, viewed Caesar's growing power with alarm. They demanded he return to Rome as a private citizen, knowing that without his military command, he would be vulnerable to prosecution by his political enemies. Caesar's response was to march on Rome itself. As he stood at the Rubicon, he allegedly spoke the words that would echo through history. Alia acta state, the die is cast. The moment he crossed that river, he became an enemy of the Roman Republic. There could be no turning back. The civil war that followed was swift and decisive. Caesar's veterans, hardened by years of campaigning, swept aside all opposition. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was murdered on the orders of the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII. Caesar wept when he saw his former ally's head, not from grief but from the knowledge that a great man had died ignobly. In Egypt, Caesar met Cleopatra VII, the brilliant and beautiful queen who would become his lover and ally. Their relationship was as much political as personal. She needed Roman protection. He needed Egyptian wealth. Together, they sailed down the Nile at a golden barge, planning the future of the Mediterranean world. But Caesar's true destiny lay in Rome. He returned to a city that hailed him as a god while fearing him as a tyrant. He celebrated for triumphs, parading his captives and treasures through the streets while the people cheered. Vercingetorix, the brave Gallic king, was strangled in the traditional manner, his death marking the end of Celtic independence. Caesar's reforms were revolutionary. He granted citizenship to provincials, reformed the calendar, and launched massive public works projects. He filled the Senate with his supporters and assumed the title of Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. Some whispered that he sought to be crowned king, the most hated title in Roman history. The conspiracy against Caesar was born from republican idealism and personal ambition. Brutus, whom Caesar loved like a son, joined the plot believing he was saving the republic. On the Ides of March 44 BC, Caesar walked into the Senate house despite warnings from soothsayers and his wife Calpurnia's prophetic dreams. "Beware the Ides of March," a seer had warned him. Caesar's response was characteristic. "The Ides of March have come." The seer's reply was prophetic. "Aye, but they have not yet gone." The assassination was brutal and chaotic. 23 senators surrounded Caesar, each striking a blow to share the guilt. When Caesar saw Brutus among his attackers, he allegedly gasped, "Et tu, Brute? And you, Brutus?" He fell at the base of Pompey's statue, his blood pooling on the marble floor. But Caesar's death did not restore the Republic. Instead, it plunged Rome into another civil war. His heir, Octavian, would emerge victorious and become Augustus, the first Roman emperor. The Republic died with Caesar, but his legacy lived on in the empire he had made possible. The sun blazed mercilessly over the arid hills of Palestine as two armies faced each other across the narrow valley of Hattin. It was July 4, 1187, and the fate of the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem hung in the balance. On one side stood the combined forces of Christian knights from across Europe, their heavy armor gleaming like mirrors in the desert heat. On the other, the disciplined ranks of Muslim warriors led by a Kurdish warrior who had become the most feared and respected ruler in the Islamic world. Saladin Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to history as Saladin. Born in 1137 in the fortress town of Tikrit, Saladin was the son of Najm al-Din Ayyub, a Kurdish military commander in service to the Zengid dynasty. His childhood was spent not in palaces, but in military camps, where he learned the arts of war and statecraft from his father and uncle, Shirkuh. The young Saladin absorbed the lessons of desert warfare, the importance of water sources, and the delicate balance of tribal politics that governed the fractured Islamic world. When Saladin was still a boy, his family moved to Baalbek in modern-day Lebanon, where his father served as governor. Here, Saladin received a classical Islamic education, studying the Quran, Islamic law, and the poetry of the great Arab masters. He was particularly drawn to the concept of jihad, not merely as holy war, but as the spiritual struggle to create a just society under God's law. The turning point in Saladin's life came in 1164 when he accompanied his uncle Shirkuh on a military expedition to Egypt. The Fatimid Caliphate was collapsing, torn apart by internal strife and external pressures from both the Crusaders and the Sunni Muslim states of Syria. Shirkuh, serving as a general for Nur al-Din, the ruler of Damascus, saw an opportunity to extend Zengid influence into the wealthy Nile Valley. Egypt was a prize worth fighting for. The annual flood of the Nile created the most fertile agricultural land in the Mediterranean world, while the trade routes between Europe and Asia passed through Alexandria and Cairo. Control of Egypt would provide the resources necessary to challenge the Crusader states that had carved out kingdoms along the eastern Mediterranean coast. The first Egyptian expedition was a disaster. Saladin, then only 27, found himself trapped in Alexandria with a small force while a massive Crusader army laid siege to the city. For months, the young Kurdish warrior held the walls against overwhelming odds. The defenders were reduced to eating their horses, and Saladin himself was wounded in the fighting. But his courage in the face of impossible odds earned him the respect of his men and the attention of the Islamic world. When Shirkuh died suddenly in 1169, Saladin found himself the unlikely ruler of Egypt. He was young, Kurdish in an Arab world, and commanded only a small force of foreign soldiers. The Fatimid court expected him to be a puppet ruler, easily manipulated by the established power brokers. They were catastrophically wrong. Saladin's first priority was to consolidate his control over Egypt. He systematically eliminated potential rivals, disbanded the Fatimid army, and replaced the existing administration with his own supporters. In 1171, he took the decisive step of ending the Fatimid Caliphate, proclaiming the Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad as the legitimate ruler of all Islam. This act of religious unification would prove crucial to his later success. The young sultan understood that Egypt's wealth meant nothing without military power. He began a systematic program of military reform, creating a professional army that combined the best elements of Kurdish mounted archers, Turkish horse soldiers, and Arab infantry. He established a network of spies and informants that stretched from Constantinople to Baghdad, giving him intelligence advantages that his enemies could not match. But Saladin's greatest strength was his understanding of Islamic law and his reputation for justice. Unlike many rulers of his time, he was genuinely pious, praying 5 times a day and consulting with Islamic scholars on matters of law and ethics. He established hospitals, schools, and charitable foundations throughout his territories. Common people began to see him not as a foreign conqueror, but as a just ruler who embodied the best ideals of Islam. The Crusader states watched Saladin's rise with growing alarm. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, established after the First Crusade in 1099, had survived for nearly a century by exploiting the divisions among Muslim rulers. Now, for the first time since the Crusades began, they faced a unified Islamic power with the resources and determination to challenge their presence in the Holy Land. Saladin's strategy was patient and methodical. He first secured his position in Egypt, then gradually expanded his control over Syria. When Nur al-Din died in 1174, Saladin moved to claim Damascus, presenting himself as the rightful heir to the Zengid legacy. The conquest of Syria was not easy. He faced resistance from other Muslim rulers who saw him as an upstart, but by 1186, he controlled a vast territory stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates. The final confrontation with the Crusaders was precipitated by the actions of Reynold of Chatillon, a brutal French knight who controlled the fortress of Kara. Reynold had repeatedly broken truces with Saladin, raiding Muslim pilgrimage caravans and even threatening to attack the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. When Reynold captured a caravan that included Saladin's sister, the Sultan decided that the time for patience was over. Saladin's army that gathered for the 1187 campaign was the largest Muslim force assembled since the First Crusade. It included Kurdish and Turkish cavalry, Egyptian infantry, Bedouin scouts, and volunteers from across the Islamic world who had come to participate in jihad. The army was superbly organized, with a sophisticated supply system that could sustain operations in the desert regions of Palestine. The Crusader response was equally massive. King Guy of Jerusalem assembled virtually every available knight from the Crusader states, supplemented by military orders like the Knights Templar and Hospitaller. The Christian army that marched from Sephora numbered over 20,000 men, including 1,200 heavy cavalry, the largest force the Crusader states had ever fielded. Saladin's tactical genius lay in his understanding of desert warfare. He lured the Crusader army away from its water sources at Sephora, forcing them to march across the burning hills of Galilee in the height of summer. As the heavily armored knights suffered from heat exhaustion and dehydration, Saladin's mounted archers harassed their flanks, preventing them from reaching the vital springs at Hattin. The battle itself was a masterpiece of medieval warfare. Saladin positioned his army on the high ground around the Horns of Hattin, twin peaks that dominated the surrounding countryside. The Crusaders, desperate for water, launched a series of uphill charges against the Muslim positions. Each attack was repelled with devastating losses. The climax came when Saladin ordered his men to set fire to the dry grass around the Christian positions. Smoke and flames engulfed the Crusader ranks, adding to their torment. King Guy's tent was overrun, and the true cross, the most sacred relic in the Christian world, was captured. The flower of Crusader chivalry was destroyed in a single afternoon. Saladin's treatment of his prisoners revealed his character. Common soldiers were sold into slavery, as was the custom of the time, but nobles were treated with honor, and many were ransomed or released. The only exception was Reynold of Chatillon, whom Saladin executed personally for his crimes against Muslim pilgrims. The victory at Hattin opened the road to Jerusalem. As news of the disaster spread, panic gripped the Crusader states. City after city surrendered without a fight, their garrisons either dead at Hattin or too weak to resist. By September 1187, Saladin's army stood before the walls of Jerusalem itself. The siege of Jerusalem lasted only 12 days. The city's defenders, led by Balian of Ibelin, negotiated a surrender that would allow the Christian population to leave safely upon payment of a ransom. Saladin's entry into Jerusalem on October 2, 1187, was a moment of profound symbolism. The city that had been drenched in blood during the First Crusade was reclaimed without a massacre. Saladin's treatment of Jerusalem's Christian population stood in stark contrast to the behavior of the Crusaders in 1099. He allowed safe passage for those who could pay the ransom, and used his own funds to free those who could not. Christian pilgrims were guaranteed safe access to the holy sites, and the city's Jewish population, which had been banned during Crusader rule, was allowed to return. The fall of Jerusalem shocked Europe and prompted the Third Crusade. The greatest kings of the age, Philip Augustus of France, Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, and Richard the Lionheart of England, took the cross to reclaim the holy city. But Saladin had learned from his previous encounters with the Crusaders. He avoided pitched battles, used hit-and-run tactics, and gradually wore down the massive Christian army. The duel between Saladin and Richard the Lionheart became the stuff of legend. Richard was undoubtedly one of the greatest warriors of his age, But Saladin proved to be his equal in both military skill and chivalric honor. When Richard fell with fever, Saladin sent him ice and fresh fruit. When Richard's horse was killed in battle, Saladin sent him a replacement. Their mutual respect transcended the bitter religious divide that separated their armies. The Third Crusade ended in stalemate. Richard recaptured the coastal cities of Acre and Jaffa, but Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. The Treaty of Jaffa in 1192 guaranteed Christian pilgrims access to the holy sites, while recognizing Saladin's control over the interior of Palestine. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but ended the immediate threat to both sides. Saladin's final years were spent not in conquest but in consolidation. He worked to establish a stable government that could survive his death, building institutions that would preserve his achievements. He founded madrasas, Islamic schools, and hospitals, promoted trade and agriculture, and tried to heal the divisions that had weakened the Islamic world for generations. When Saladin died in Damascus on March 4, 1193, his personal treasury contained only 47 silver dirhams and a single gold piece, not enough to pay for his funeral. He had given away his wealth to the poor and to fund his charitable foundations. His biographer Baha'u'llah wrote that he had never hoarded money or accumulated wealth, but was always giving away what he had. Saladin's legacy extended far beyond his military victories. He had demonstrated that it was possible to be both a successful military commander and a ruler guided by moral principles. His reputation for justice and mercy made him a hero not only to Muslims, but to many Christians as well. Even Dante, writing his Divine Comedy a century later, placed Saladin in limbo rather than hell, recognizing his virtue despite his non-Christian faith. The Ayyubid dynasty that Saladin founded would rule Egypt and Syria for over a century, but none of his successors matched his combination of military genius and moral authority. The Crusader states would linger for another century, but they never recovered from the devastating blow Saladin had dealt them at Hattin. The kerosene lamp flickered in the pre-dawn darkness of the White House as Abraham Lincoln bent over his desk, his gaunt frame casting long shadows across the scattered papers. It was January 1863, and the 16th President of the United States was putting the finishing touches on what would become the most consequential document in American history since the Constitution itself. The Emancipation Proclamation lay before him, ready to transform a war to preserve the Union into a crusade for human freedom. Lincoln's weathered hands, marked by years of frontier labor, held the pen that would liberate 4 million enslaved Americans. At 54, the president looked older than his years, his face deeply lined by the weight of a nation tearing itself apart. Behind his deep-set eyes lay the accumulated wisdom of a man who had risen from the humblest beginnings to the highest office in the land, guided by an unwavering belief in the principles of democracy and human dignity. Born in a one-room log cabin in Kentucky on February 12, 1809, Lincoln entered the world in circumstances that would have doomed most men to a life of poverty. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a struggling farmer who moved the family repeatedly in search of better opportunities. Young Abraham's childhood was marked by back-breaking labor, minimal formal education, and the constant struggle for survival that defined frontier life. The Lincoln family's move to Indiana in 1816 was prompted by land disputes and Thomas's moral opposition to slavery. In the dense forests of southern Indiana, 7-year-old Abraham learned to wield an axe with skill that would earn him the nickname the Rail Splitter. But even as he labored in the fields and forests, the boy displayed an insatiable hunger for knowledge. He read every book he could find, often by firelight, memorizing passages from the Bible, Pilgrim's Progress, and Aesop's fables. The death of Lincoln's beloved mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, in 1818 was a devastating blow to the 9-year-old boy. Nancy had been his intellectual mentor, encouraging his love of learning and instilling in him a deep sense of compassion for all living things. Her death from milk sickness, a disease caused by cattle eating poisonous plants, left Lincoln with a profound sadness that would shadow him throughout his life. Lincoln's formal education totaled less than a year, but his self-education was extraordinary. He mastered grammar, mathematics, and rhetoric through sheer force of will. When he encountered a new word, he would use it in conversations until it became part of his vocabulary. Neighbors remembered him as a young man who could be found reading while plowing, a book balanced on his plow handles. The family's move to Illinois in 1830 marked the beginning of Lincoln's transformation from frontier labor to lawyer and politician. At 21, he was finally free from his father's authority and able to pursue his own destiny. He settled in New Salem, a small frontier town where he worked as a store clerk, postmaster, and surveyor while studying law by candlelight. Lincoln's entry into politics came naturally. His height, 6 feet 4 inches, and his ability to tell stories made him a natural leader in the rough-and-tumble world of frontier democracy. He was elected to the Illinois General Assembly in 1834 as a Whig, a party that supported internal improvements and opposed the expansion of slavery. His political philosophy was shaped by his hero, Henry Clay, who believed in the American system of economic development and gradual emancipation. The young legislator's first encounter with the slavery question came in 1837 when he issued a protest against a resolution supporting slavery. Lincoln and his colleague Dan Stone declared that the institution of slavery is founded on both injustice and bad policy. It was a courageous stand in a state where many settlers had come from the South and brought their pro-slavery attitudes with them. Lincoln's legal career began in earnest in 1837 when he received his law license and moved to Springfield, the new state capital. He quickly established himself as one of the most skilled attorneys in Illinois, known for his honesty, his ability to connect with juries, and his mastery of legal precedent. His nickname Honest Abe was earned through his scrupulous ethical standards and his refusal to take cases he believed were unjust. The courtroom was Lincoln's laboratory for understanding human nature. He learned to read people's motivations, to present complex arguments in simple terms, and to find the moral core of legal disputes. His most famous case involved defending the son of his friend Jack Armstrong, who was accused of murder. Lincoln's dramatic nighttime demonstration that the key witness could not have seen the crime by moonlight, using an almanac to prove the moon was not visible at the claimed time, secured an acquittal and enhanced his reputation. Lincoln's marriage to Mary Todd in 1842 was both a love match and a political alliance. Mary came from a prominent Kentucky family and shared Lincoln's Whig politics and anti-slavery views. Their relationship was passionate but turbulent, marked by Mary's emotional intensity and Lincoln's periods of deep depression. Together, they had 4 sons, Robert, Edward, William, and Thomas. The death of Edward in 1850 and William in 1862 would bring profound grief to both parents. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 marked Lincoln's return to active politics after a hiatus following his single term in Congress. The act, sponsored by Senator Stephen Douglas, repealed the Missouri Compromise and opened the possibility of slavery in territories where it had been prohibited. Lincoln was outraged by what he saw as a betrayal of the founding principles of the Republic. Lincoln's response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act revealed his evolving political philosophy. He believed that the founders had intended slavery to be placed on a path toward ultimate extinction. The expansion of slavery into new territories would perpetuate and strengthen the institution, making eventual emancipation impossible. In a speech in Peoria, Lincoln declared, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong." The formation of the Republican Party in 1854 gave Lincoln a new political home. The party was united by opposition to the expansion of slavery, and Lincoln quickly emerged as one of its most effective speakers. His debates with Stephen Douglas during the 1858 Senate campaign brought him national attention and established him as a leading voice for the anti-slavery cause. The Lincoln-Douglas debates were a masterclass in democratic discourse. Over the course of 7 encounters, the two men presented fundamentally different visions of America's future. Douglas advocated popular sovereignty, letting each territory decide for itself whether to allow slavery. Lincoln argued that slavery was a moral wrong that should not be allowed to spread, famously declaring, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." Though Lincoln lost the Senate race, the debates established him as a national figure and potential presidential candidate. His speeches were reprinted in newspapers across the country, and his principles stand against slavery expansion resonated with Northern voters who were increasingly concerned about the political power of the slaveholding South. Lincoln's nomination for president in 1860 was something of a surprise. He was less well-known than rivals like William Seward and Salmon Chase, but his moderate image and his strength in the crucial swing states of the Midwest made him an attractive compromise candidate. The Republican platform opposed the expansion of slavery but promised not to interfere with the institution where it already existed. The election of 1860 was really for separate campaigns, with the Democratic Party splitting along sectional lines. Lincoln won only 39.8% of the popular vote but carried every northern state except New Jersey, giving him a clear electoral college victory. His election was seen by many Southerners as a mortal threat to their way of life, and 7 states seceded from the Union before he even took office. Lincoln's inaugural address on March 4, 1861, was a masterpiece of political rhetoric. He combined firmness with conciliation, making clear that he would not tolerate secession while appealing to the better angels of our nature. He promised not to interfere with slavery where it existed but declared that the Union was perpetual and that secession was legally impossible. The attack on Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861 forced Lincoln's hand. The president faced a choice between allowing the Union to dissolve or using force to preserve it. His decision to call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion was the moment when the United States truly became a nation rather than a loose confederation of states. Lincoln's leadership during the Civil War evolved as the conflict itself evolved. Initially, he defined the war's purpose as preserving the Union, believing that this goal would unite the broadest possible coalition. But as the war dragged on and casualties mounted, Lincoln began to see that the conflict could serve a higher purpose: the liberation of the enslaved. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued on January 1, 1863, was both a military necessity and a moral imperative. By freeing the slaves in rebellious states, Lincoln deprived the Confederacy of a crucial source of labor while providing the Union with a new source of soldiers. More importantly, he transformed the war from a political dispute into a moral crusade that would inspire the world. Lincoln's management of the war effort revealed his growth as a leader. He learned to balance competing demands from radical Republicans who wanted immediate abolition and conservative Democrats who opposed emancipation. He mastered the art of timing, knowing when to push forward and when to wait for public opinion to catch up with his vision. The president's relationship with his generals was complex and often frustrating. He cycled through commanders like George McClellan, Ambrose Burnside, and Joseph Hooker before finding in Ulysses Grant a general who shared his determination to win at any cost. Lincoln's strategic vision was simple but profound: use the Union's advantages in population and industrial capacity to wear down the Confederacy's ability to resist. Lincoln's greatest speeches came during the war's darkest hours. The Gettysburg Address, delivered at the dedication of a cemetery for the battle's dead, redefined the war's purpose in language of transcendent beauty. In just 272 words, Lincoln transformed a military cemetery into a symbol of national rebirth, declaring that the dead had consecrated the battlefield with their sacrifice. The president's ray, Election in 1864 was far from certain. War weariness gripped the North, and many voters were ready to accept a negotiated peace that would have left slavery intact. Lincoln's opponent, General George McClellan, ran on a platform of ending the war through compromise. But Sherman's capture of Atlanta and Sheridan's victories in the Shenandoah Valley gave Lincoln the military success he needed to win re-election. Lincoln's second inaugural address, delivered on March 4, 1865, was perhaps his greatest speech. With the war nearly won, he could have been triumphant. Instead, he was magnanimous, calling for healing and reconciliation with malice toward none, with charity for all. He understood that the greater challenge lay ahead, binding up the nation's wounds and creating a just peace. The assassination of Lincoln on April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, was a tragedy that deprived the nation of its greatest leader at its moment of greatest need. John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer and actor, shot the president as he watched a play at Ford's Theater. Lincoln died the next morning, becoming a martyr to the cause of freedom and union. Lincoln's legacy is inscribed in the Constitution itself. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, abolishing slavery, guaranteeing equal protection under law, and protecting voting rights, were the legislative fruits of his moral leadership. He had preserved the Union and given it a new birth of freedom, transforming the United States from a nation divided by slavery into a beacon of hope for oppressed people everywhere. These three extraordinary leaders, Julius Caesar, Saladin, and Abraham Lincoln, lived in different centuries, led different civilizations, and faced vastly different challenges. Yet their stories reveal timeless truths about the nature of leadership, the exercise of power, and the forces that shape human history. Caesar's story illustrates the double-edged nature of ambition. His military genius and political acumen transformed Rome from a regional power into a world empire, but his crossing of the Rubicon also marked the death of the Roman Republic. His legacy reminds us that great leaders can create lasting change, but at the cost of existing institutions and traditions. The Roman Empire he made possible would endure for centuries, spreading law, language, and culture across the Western world. Saladin's legacy demonstrates that moral authority can be as powerful as military force. His reconquest of Jerusalem was important, but his reputation for justice and mercy was equally significant. He showed that it was possible to be both a successful warrior and a ruler guided by ethical principles. His example of chivalrous conduct influenced both Muslim and Christian concepts of honorable warfare and helped establish the foundations of international law. Lincoln's story reveals the transformative power of principled leadership during times of crisis. His preservation of the Union and emancipation of the slaves redefined American democracy and inspired freedom movements around the world. His ability to combine moral vision with political pragmatism shows how great leaders can navigate the treacherous waters of democratic politics while advancing the cause of human progress. What united these three men was their understanding that leadership requires more than personal ambition or tactical skill. Each recognized that true leadership means serving something greater than oneself, whether that be the glory of Rome, the unity of Islam, or the preservation of democratic government. They understood that power without purpose is ultimately meaningless, and that the greatest leaders are those who use their authority to expand human freedom and dignity. Their stories also remind us that leadership is not about perfection but about the courage to act decisively in moments of crisis. Caesar's decision to cross the Rubicon, Saladin's choice to unite the Islamic world, and Lincoln's determination to preserve the Union all involved enormous risks and uncertain outcomes. Yet each man understood that great moments in history require leaders willing to stake everything on their vision of the future. In our own turbulent times, these historical examples offer both inspiration and warning. They show us that individual leaders can indeed change the course of history, but they also remind us that the exercise of power always comes with profound responsibilities. The best leaders are those who understand that their primary duty is not to themselves but to the people they serve and the principles they represent. As we face the challenges of the 21st century, we can draw strength from these examples of leadership under pressure. Whether dealing with political division, social injustice, or global conflicts, the lessons of Caesar, Saladin, and Lincoln remain relevant. They remind us that courage, wisdom, and moral clarity are not relics of the past but essential qualities for any leader who hopes to make a positive difference in the world. If you enjoyed these stories of leadership and courage, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more fascinating tales from history. Which of these three leaders inspired you most? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know what other historical figures you'd like to hear about in future videos. Remember, the past is not just a collection of old stories. It's a guide to understanding our present and shaping our future. Until next time, keep exploring the remarkable human story that connects us all across the centuries.